Greetings, fellow detectives. Wizard Kitten here, bringing you a new Nancy Drew analysis video. Today's video is brought to you by the patrons over at Mystique Manor. Thank you for your continued support. One of my favorite things to do is to analyze the way that different themes are used within the Nancy Drew series as part of the storytelling. I've done this now with mental health in the series, relationships in the series, personality types in the series, and now I'd like to examine the way that family dynamics are used in the series. This idea was brought up during one of my most recent live streams, and it immediately grabbed my attention. So today I'd like to look at this from two angles. First, by discussing the families that are included in the series, and then by looking at how the dynamics of each of those families is used to enhance or build the storytelling of the game. This also begs an interesting question, which I hope to answer by the end. Can only dysfunctional families have compelling stories? In order to be included as part of this video, at least two members of a family must be physical characters and must interact together in some way. In addition, the dynamic of the family must play a major role in the mystery itself. This criteria eliminates some families and family stories that are included in the games, but I wanted to specifically focus on instances in which families are used as a major part of the story and subsequent mystery. Before we begin, here is your obligatory spoiler warning. The plots and characters of the following games will be discussed in detail, including culprit information. You have been warned. And because stories often work nicely in parts, we will be going chapter by chapter. Chapter 1, Change. The Penvellyn family of Curse of Blackmore Manor. It has been said that the one true constant in life is change, and the story of the Penvellyn family illustrates this concept marvelously. In the game, we meet Jane Penvellyn, her great-aunt Letitia Drake, and her stepmother Linda Penvellyn. We also speak with Jane's biological father, Hugh Penvellyn, on the phone. Beyond the present-day Penvellyn family, Nancy can also uncover the secrets of centuries of Penvellyns, many of which are related to change. The whole premise of the mystery in Curse of Blackmore Manor is that Linda has changed. She's become combative, isolated, and simply unwell. We come to learn that these mental changes are accompanied by some terrifying physical changes, all of which combine to create the biggest change of all. Linda has been cursed and is shifting into the Beast of Blackmore, a werewolf. But Linda isn't alone. While she has been dealing with multiple life changes before the mystery, including marriage, becoming a stepmother, and moving from the US to isolated Blackmore Manor in England, the other members of the Penvellyn family have also all undergone major life changes. Mrs. Drake recently lost her only brother, Alan Penvellyn, and went from living alone at Blackmore to living with Jane and Linda. Hugh Penvellyn went through a divorce and is now newly married. Jane experiences the divorce of her parents, her father's remarriage, and moving back to Blackmore Manor. That's a lot of change in a short period of time. When we call Paliki Vadas an expert in lycanthropy, aka werewolf science, she informs us that those who are under a great deal of emotional duress, those who have recently undergone a great number of life changes, are most susceptible to the effects of lycanthropy due to their emotionally vulnerable state. This illustrates the incredible stress that change can have on our minds and bodies, and the different ways that people might cope. For Linda, she becomes vulnerable to suggestion and is so overwhelmed that she genuinely believes in her curse. Mrs. Drake appears to isolate herself almost exclusively in the conservatory. Jane lashes out, unable to process the idea that her life is now so different, but could somehow still be okay. But none of them talk about how change is the culprit. The Penvellyn family, instead, ends up fending for themselves and oftentimes subtly blame others for their feelings of discomfort and stress. The stress of change itself is never identified as the culprit, and none of the Penvellyn family members acknowledge their difficulties adjusting to their new lives, at least not until the end, and we discover the true motives of the culprit. And we see this theme of change throughout the rest of the mystery as well. The family crest that changes with each new generation, the Penvellyn family puzzle that changes and adjusts through the centuries to accommodate new initiates, the changing times and views as indicated in the Penvellyn family journal. Change is pervasive, but it's also important. Change is what allows the Penvellyn family's legacy and treasure to endure. While traditions must endure alongside in order to preserve the family's secrets, as in the ritual or the mutus liber, it's the additions and slight modifications through the years that really make the Penvellyns last. So what does this all mean? The overall theme of change and struggling to adapt to it results in a great deal of conflict and continued suffering for the Penvellyns. They could speak with one another about their feelings and acknowledge their stress, but instead they choose to suffer alone until their resentment towards one another builds, and one of them turns into a werewolf. And does this result in a good story? Absolutely, because it feels incredibly relatable and also builds a central conflict and theme around which to focus the entire story and mystery. Would the Penvellyn family have been as compelling if they were all getting along and being honest about their struggles to adapt? Perhaps not. Chapter 2, Greed, the Mapus of Creature of Kapu Cave. This mystery centers around the overarching premise that each of us inherently deserves something out of life. For Quigley Kim, it's recognition. For Malachi Craven, it's adoration. For the Mapus, it's wealth. Big Island Mike Mapu and his daughter, Pua Mapu, run Big Island Mike's immersion excursion. Pua contributes her skills as a professional surfer, giving lessons to tourists as part of the business. Those same tourists pay Big Island Mike to stay at his immersion excursion and get a sense of real Hawaii. To get this sense, tourists are told to go fishing, eat shaved ice, and find shells on the beach to make necklaces. Tourists must pay for materials in order to participate in this system with Big Island bucks, and they are paid in return for their creations or catches with Big Island bucks. Obviously, Big Island bucks can only be used at Big Island Mike's resort, which means he gets to make additional profit by getting tourists to engage in free labor, catching fish and making necklaces that he can then sell to others for real money. Shady business practices? Yes, absolutely. Born out of greed for material wealth? Why else? But the theme of greed within the Mapu family does not stop there. By the end of the mystery, we find out that Big Island Mike owed a lot of money to loan sharks, and that the property of the Healy Healy Research Facility used to belong to his aunt. She donated the land to the research center with the stipulation that, should the center ever close, Big Island Mike would then get the land. He wanted to sell the land in order to pay off his debts, so his solution was to destroy the entire local pineapple crop and blame the Healy Healy so that they would be forced to close. If we go with the definition of greed as wanting something that you believe you deserve to have, regardless of the effect that it has on others, well, the selfish acts of the Mapus couldn't illustrate it more perfectly. They decided to destroy an entire pineapple crop, impacting the lives of countless workers and impacting a food supply, because of initial debts likely relating to his already shady business. Greed at work led to the demise of the Mapus. Would there have even been a mystery if the Mapus had taken a different path? One paved with less of an eye on the prize and one more focused on the practical steps to take along the way? Unlikely. And so, only 2 families in, our hypothesis seems to be reinforced. Dysfunctional families and dysfunctional practices, thus far, are making for more compelling stories. Chapter 3, Intransigence, the Malloy family of the haunting of Castle Malloy. Intransigence essentially equates to stubbornness, a refusal to change one's views on something or a refusal to agree. We see this within all the characters of this game. Kit refuses to believe that Matt is missing, and will accept no theory other than that he got cold feet. Denal refuses to believe that Matt was not in fact kidnapped by the Fairfolk. We perhaps, though, see this theme in its strongest form, with the beginning family dynamics of Kyler Malloy and Matt Simmons. Kyler and Matt fundamentally disagree about him playing pranks. Matt sees them as harmless and entertaining, while Kyler sees them as childish and irresponsible. Neither is willing to budge on their viewpoints, despite the fact that this seems to have been a consistent argument and point of discontent. And while disagreements in a relationship are perfectly normal and healthy, a complete and utter refusal to budge, compromise, or acknowledge the perspective of the other person can lead to some pretty serious rifts. An argument could be made that this rift is almost entirely responsible for the confusion surrounding Matt's disappearance and the subsequent difficulty that Nancy experiences in trying to find him. Kyler refuses to believe that this is anything other than a prank, and again, the very stubborn opinions of the other characters doesn't help Nancy either. The proverbial waters are muddied with vastly different opinions, and no one is willing to budge until Nancy can prove them wrong with evidence, like Matt's broken glasses or his missing suitcases. It's this constant feeling of Kyler and Matt being at odds with one another that fuels gossip from Kit, annoyance from Alan Payne, and disdain from Denal. With everyone's opinions at odds and no one willing to compromise or problem solve together, Matt ends up being trapped and lost for much longer than he perhaps would have been otherwise. But a quick answer to Matt's disappearance, where everyone comes together from a place of understanding and empathy even if they disagree, doesn't make for a very long mystery. Interesting. Chapter 4, Guilt. The Shimizu family of Shadow at the Water's Edge. The loss of a family member is devastating and can rock a family to its very core. Grieving that loss is long, complicated, messy, nonlinear, and difficult, but it's a process that each of us will have to endure if we have not already. The Shimizu family is entrenched in this process, but all of them appear to be stuck at the same stage: guilt. This is a recognized stage in certain models of the grieving process, and it results in some incredibly painful memories and emotions. We hear Takai discuss her guilt at tricking Kasumi into cleaning the pool instead of herself. It should have been me, and she knows, Takai tells us. We learn of Yumi's guilt at being the one to find her mother in the baths, but feeling like she wasn't fast enough. We learn of Miwako's guilt at knowing she was there in the building when it happened, but she couldn't do anything to stop it. Further, the Shimizu family experiences a great deal of guilt surrounding the responsibilities of the ryokan. Yumi, as the oldest daughter, is traditionally supposed to run the ryokan, and her grandmother and sister continually remind her of this. Miwako feels guilty for staying at the ryokan and not going to the city with Rentaro, even though she knows that it isn't what she really wants. Each of them is absolutely entrenched in guilt, which leads to them experiencing frequent conflict with one another, a lack of closeness and vulnerability with one another, an inability to empathize with one another, and an inability to recognize their shared traumatic experience and move forward together. But where would the mystery be without all this guilt? Nancy has such a difficult time making progress within the game because the characters, perhaps rightfully so, have absolutely no interest in discussing the case with her. But they also have no interest in discussing it with each other. Nancy therefore has very little access to information and must spend precious time seeking information from other places. Their guilt prevents them from noticing any strange patterns or clues. Rentaro asks at one point during the game, "Why do ghosts always want revenge?" and posits that the answer is because the ghost is only real to people who are experiencing guilt surrounding the individual's death. Well, he's certainly not wrong, and does it make for a compelling mystery and story? It certainly does. Chapter 5, Envy, the Thorntons of Ghost of Thornton Hall. Boy, is this family dynamic dysfunctional. In this game, we learn of and experience the haunting of Charlotte Thornton, a family member who perished in a deadly fire years ago. In the present day, Jessalyn Thornton, a family member very similar in personality to Charlotte, has gone missing, and Jessalyn's mother, Clara Thornton, and her first cousins once removed, Wade Thornton and Harper Thornton, all end up on Black Rock Island out of concern for her safety. The overarching problem with the Thornton family, according to Wade, is that a terrible factory accident years ago that resulted in the death of 54 innocent lives led to a division in the family, half swearing that accidents like that should never have happened and will never happen again, and the other half essentially explaining the tragedy away as an unfortunate accident that was regrettable but not something to feel badly about or try to change. These two Thornton family factions appear to have delineated themselves into good and evil, with each side viewing the other as the evil one. And as destructive as that is, what is perhaps more destructive is individuals on each side envying what the others appear to have. Take, for example, Clara Thornton, who we can assume lands on the side of the unfortunate accidents. While she is wealthy, powerful, intimidating, and connected, she envied Charlotte for her seemingly effortless ability to get others to like her, to be loved and cared for by others. This envy became so toxic that Clara was willing to set fire to a building that Charlotte was in when she found out that Charlotte's will had been changed. This, of course, resulted in Charlotte's death, which, as far as we can tell with Clara up until the game's end, was regrettable to her, but certainly didn't mean that Harper could get away with pushing her off the widow's walk, or that Wade could get away with damaging factory equipment in order to protect workers. No. In her mind, others had everything, and she had nothing. Her words, not mine. But she isn't alone. It's clear that Harper envies other members of her family for the relative stability and tranquility of their lives in comparison to hers. Wade clearly envies Clara's ability to make decisions for the family company, even though he says that he does not. This compare and despair game that the Thornton family has going on has clearly led to nothing but discontent and damage. But envy is one of the most traditional mystery motives to ever exist. Someone else has what I want, and the grass is clearly greener on the other side. I will do anything to get there. It makes for a great story, certainly, though not terribly happy families. Chapter 6, Mourning. The Drew Family of the Silent Spy. I'm breaking my own rules slightly in that none of the characters included as part of this section are physical characters. Nancy Drew is herself, obviously. Carson Drew is a phone friend, and Kate Drew is a physical memory. But the presence of all three is so strongly felt within this game that I decided it would be interesting and pertinent to discuss nevertheless. Just as with the Shimizu family of Shadow at the Water's Edge, the loss of Kate Drew rocked the Drew family to their core. We see Nancy processing life without her mother in multiple games, asking prying questions in some, and deeply empathizing with characters in others. In The Silent Spy, we experience what this process must have been like for Carson. Not only did he need to learn how to cope with the loss of his wife, now he's being forced to cope with the fact that his only child is purposefully following the same dangerous footsteps that took his wife from him. Never mind the fact that Nancy has been casually placing herself in life-threatening situations with a certain zest that defies understanding at times. This realization for Carson brings up some incredibly painful memories and some very real fears. Of course he wants Nancy to live her life, but how on earth can he do so peacefully when her life is filled with so much danger? Perhaps one of the reasons that this is so jarring for Carson, and one of the reasons that Nancy is so impulsive and irresponsible in The Silent Spy, comes down to the fact that neither of them has fully mourned the loss of Kate Drew and discussed what the loss meant to one another. At the end of the game, Nancy and Carson talk to one another about how neither of them ever spoke of Kate, because they thought that the other didn't want to, despite both of them very much wanting to. It's a breach in communication for sure, but I think it also comes from a place of lacking vulnerability. Both of them seemed to adjust so well. Nancy is successful, brave, and confident, and so perhaps Carson assumed she was doing fine. No difficulties on Carson's side were ever intimated in any previous messages either. And so Nancy likely assumed that her father had no hang-ups. When you think that someone isn't experiencing hardship in the same way that you are, it can be incredibly difficult to open up to that person. Ultimately, a large portion of the plot of The Silent Spy involves Nancy and Carson learning to speak to one another about these difficult topics and acknowledging how they each must feel. Secrets come into the open, and Nancy is only able to solve the mystery once this is the case. At least in this situation, resolving the dysfunctional family dynamic appears to be what results in the mystery being solved. Chapter 7, Distrust, the Perry family of Midnight in Salem. We all know how I feel about this game, and if you don't, check out the card in the upper corner. Regardless, the Perry family of Midnight in Salem meets our criteria and therefore deserves discussion. In the game, we meet sisters May and Tegan Perry. We learn that their parents are off exploring the world somewhere and have essentially just left the sisters at home to fend for themselves, which in some scenarios would be perfectly acceptable. But in the context of this game, with the difficulties that May is facing, seems like a breeding ground for distrust of their parental figures. But the distrust certainly doesn't end there. May doesn't trust anyone enough to speak to them about the difficulties she is facing, not even her cousin or her sister. As we later learn, this distrust is highly warranted, since Tegan was the one who started the fire at the Hathorn house, albeit by accident, and seemed perfectly willing to let her sister take the fall. This is horrible, of course, but Tegan also doesn't seem to trust her sister either. She certainly doesn't trust other members in the town, or her friends, or her cousin or Nancy, so it's perhaps no surprise that she has so little faith in her sister's ability to defend herself that she isn't particularly worried about her secrets coming out. Distrust blooms from repeated instances of having our trust violated. When someone says they'll do something for you and they don't. When someone says they understand you but proceeds to act as if they do not. When someone indicates that they'll be there for you but never show up. It seems likely that, growing up, neither Tegan or May were able to establish trusting relationships with each other, and, by extension, with anyone else. And just like in our previous discussions of family dynamics, it's specifically this trust that slows Nancy down in solving the mystery. The characters don't trust her enough to be honest or vulnerable with her. And how could they when they don't even trust each other? This results in Nancy being given false, empty, or misleading information, which of course ends up being how the mystery is built. There's no mystery if Nancy doesn't have any messy knots to unravel. So, when families are included as part of the story, can there even be a mystery if the family dynamics are not in some way dysfunctional? First, I guess I'd like to argue that there is no such thing as a perfectly functional family. All families, regardless of how well they get along, support one another, or coexist peacefully, have difficulties at some point in time, to a certain degree. We all have stories, and all of our families have stories. But when it comes to a mystery, I do think that it is that focus on the difficult times and the difficult dynamics that add a deeper layer to the story. While it's entirely likely that the Penvellyns, the Thorntons, the Shimizus, and so on have had wonderful moments together, those moments didn't result in anything dark or mysterious to solve. Mystery stories are based in the darkest and most twisted parts of humanity, from murder to theft out of greed. While mysteries like Ned's case of the missing keys happen, they aren't exactly the most interesting or compelling. There exists a certain fascination for the macabre within each mystery story. The things that frighten us, the things that make us squirm, the things that make us question humanity. And those kinds of things are not inherent in the happy, joyful, functional moments that we have with our families. So that appears to be my argument. Can you have a fascinating mystery if the family dynamics are not dysfunctional? Probably not, at least not if the family is directly connected to the plot in some way. Mysteries are about our dirtiest secrets and darkest desires. They are compelling exactly because they are difficult. But what do you think, fellow detectives? Do you agree with my hypothesis? What do you think about all of the families in the Nancy Drew series? Which ones do you like or dislike? Which ones do you think are the most or least dysfunctional? Let a Wizard Kitten know in the comments section down below. I hope you enjoyed today's analysis video. If you would like to come join a fantastic group of fellow detectives at Mystique Manor as a patron for the channel, gain access to exclusive content, and support the making of more content like this, please check out patreon.com/wizardkitten. And as always, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more Nancy Drew and Sims 4 content. Thank you so much for watching, fellow detectives. I will see you soon.